So as the slide says, I'm Ian Ellison-Taylor. I'm the general manager of the Client Platform and Tools group at Microsoft. So this is the group that is responsible for WPF, for Silverlight, for the developer tools for both WPF and Silverlight, application frameworks such as MEF, there was a talk on that earlier, and controls group. So we tend to deal with most of the client stuff. And I'm a general manager, so I'm normally, into PowerPoint Zen more than anything else. And the powers that be at PDC thought it would be highly entertaining if I did a more code-focused talk today. So in the grand tradition of completely unqualified managers doing code, that's what my job is here today. So we'll see how that goes. But I do have a few slides. So for those of you who are into PowerPoint, you'll get about 10 minutes worth at the beginning. I'm hoping that none of you went to the Surface talk that was right before this one. Hands up if you went to the Surface talk. Oh, dear. OK. So it's really hard to compete with Surface demos. So I don't have anything as cool as they do. But in my defense, you don't need $15,000 worth of coffee tables for my stuff. So all my stuff will be free and freely available. So that's my little dig to the Surface guys. Anyway. So this is a talk that's about WPF and Silverlight and sharing code and practices between the two. So I thought I'd open with probably the rude question, which is, why is there two things? Why is there not one thing? That's a really good question, and I thought about sort of dodging it for a while. But really, there's a couple of things. So I'm going to talk about, I think, the highest level point of the differences between Silverlight and WPF and the full .NET framework is really there are different scenarios. Obviously, WPF and the full .NET framework were designed initially for desktop scenarios and giving you the power of the PC. Part of the point of WPF was access to 3D, local hardware. These are desktop applications, so there's no security restrictions generally. And so that was its primary reason for being. Whereas on the Silverlight side of things, these are first and foremost web scenarios. So there's a bunch of different things just about being a web app than being a desktop app, not least of which being hosted in the browser. And you have an application framework that supports your plugin. So you can use a lot of the browser scenarios, a lot of the browser Chrome for things like navigation and integrating with HTML. So the scenarios are just different. So that means that there's feature differences, there's prioritization differences. WPF is very focused on putting up windows and pop-ups and all sorts of crazy things, whereas Silverlight is much more focused on the typical in-browser scenarios. So there's a whole bunch of differences because of that. Obviously, a big point of Silverlight is that it can run on devices as well. So there's a bunch of differences to deal with cross-platform, the hardware scenarios, differences in hardware. So, for example, not taking advantage of too much advantage of local hardware, you can't make these assumptions that you've got PC hardware running underneath Silverlight. So we have to do things in a different way because of that. So there's sort of the more high-level scenarios. Then there are just sort of more technical differences in the scenarios, particularly around size and performance. So as a web browser plugin, there are certain sort of obvious constraints. If you want to make a plugin kind of popular, size matters. And being a small, easy-to-download plugin is generally the way to go. If we started with a full .NET framework as a sort of a 60, 70, 80 meg plugin, that would have been kind of painful. Even if there was a technical way that we could have it running cross-platform, that would have taken some effort. We did actually, in the early days of Silverlight, look at what it would take to just slim down WPF and the full .NET framework by just ripping out things that we didn't need. And it got substantially smaller, but it was still in the sort of 10 or 12 megabyte range. So we thought we could probably get it smaller, but really, if we wanted to be serious about having a small, lightweight plugin, we kind of have to look at it the other way around. So what we did was started with a clean slate and kind of moved over code from WPF and .NET into this new code base, being very careful along the way about what we moved over. Was it really, really needed? And as we moved it over, could we make it smaller along the way? Could we rewrite it a little bit? Could we leave out some individual features that were particularly, heavyweight? And so a good example is the property system. If you're familiar with Silverlight, it has the sort of the essence of the WPF property system, but much, much simpler. It doesn't have the 15 different layers or properties and the way that styling works. And that's just because the property system in WPF is really kind of big and complicated, and it's hard to get that in a small, fast plugin. So that was part of it, just being very hardcore about starting with the smallest possible runtime. And then there's performance. WPF gets huge advantage on the desktop because of NGen. So that during setup and that first install experience, we NGen all the binaries and convert them into essentially x86. So from that point on the desktop, the biggest part of your WPF and .NET applications, the frameworks, are running in native code. And right now, at least, we don't have NGen for Silverlight running in the plugin. So if we hadn't sort of done this porting effort and moving more stuff to unmanaged code along the way, you'd have felt that jitting every single time you started up your application. So that caused us to bias a lot more to using just good old-fashioned native code. So as we were moving things over from WPF into Silverlight, we were converting them along the way into C and C++ and tuning things a little bit. So that causes a whole bunch of differences. And then there's just the sort of more general sort of technical limitations of the fact that Silverlight is a cross-platform plugin. So we have to deal with all the cross-platform differences, the differences between a Mac and a PC and Linux. And we have to deal with, probably more so than the platform, the native OS differences, is really the browser differences. Silverlight runs on IE, Safari, Firefox, and others. And they do behave very differently. And so that allows us to get the broadest possible reach, but it comes with some restrictions in terms of what we can do. Whereas full-blown WPF on the desktop doesn't have any of those restrictions. So this is the sort of the context, if you go back a couple of years, about how we ended up with these kind of two things that are highly related and highly compatible, but are different and do have some differences. So what we were trying to achieve in the constraints of that we couldn't have an identical pure subset was with these high-level goals. So obviously, we wanted to allow people to build the richest possible applications using the same people, meaning that if you have knowledge in one domain, if you're familiar with .NET, any of the .NET languages, it's going to apply exactly to Silverlight. You're not going to miss anything there. So it's basically the same people, the same skills. The programming model hasn't changed. If you've been to any of the sort of previous WPF or Silverlight talks, you'll have seen a heavy emphasis on XAML, the XML markup language that we use. And that's probably where we spent most of our time, really, between Silverlight and WPF compatibilities, making sure that for the subset that is in Silverlight, it is the same. You can take your Silverlight XAML code and you can move it into WPF and back and forth and have it be 99% compatible. It's hard to put a number on it. But extremely compatible. And I'll go through some of this in a sec, and we'll talk about it in a bit more detail. Same workflow. So as you've heard with some of the talks on Blend, we're really big on the developer designer workflow, this whole continuum thing of using XAML as a way to developers and designers to work together on the same projects, either literally on the same team or sometimes in different teams, and sometimes even the same person just being a designer one minute and being a developer the next. But that workflow is kind of fundamental to WPF and Silverlight, and we wanted to make sure that all of that, everything that you'd learned, was still applicable. And as much common code as possible. I'm going to talk about sort of the UI side of things, and I'm going to point out somewhat deliberately some of the bigger differences. And so I'm going to actually gloss over many of the things that are the same. And one of the things that kind of is the same is the business logic. I mean, most of our applications tend to have an awful lot of business logic. This is often the more interesting bit of your application. This is the stuff that's moving messages from clients to servers and doing all sorts of local processing. And that's the same C# that, or VB that you're familiar with, or any of the .NET programming languages. So a lot of an application in a practical sense can move back and forth between Silverlight and WPF without really much problem. There are some subtleties I'll get into a little bit about how the binding works between the two. So quickly, where's that? Quickly, I'll go through some of this stuff and then get to code. So how do you decide what to use when? We have a whole bunch of white papers on this, so I'll probably save the details. But there are the obvious scenarios. If you need the broadest possible reach, then you should use Silverlight. If you need the richest possible user experience and you can live with just being on Windows desktops, then use WPF. Most people kind of fall in the middle, and so you have to sort of decide, what are the pros and cons. Anyway, these are the basic points. The main one being Silverlight is smaller and lighter, is a subset of WPF and full.NET, and much easier to deploy as a result. The deployment model for Silverlight is a web page and a trivial download. And as time goes on, there'll even be no download at all. The goal is that it'll be on 98% of the machines on the planet, and there's even nothing to install there, not even 10 or 15 seconds. So I'll go through a little bit more of that in a sec, and why the differences matter, and hopefully that'll highlight some of the scenarios. And actually, in some cases, it might highlight why you don't even need to care. If you're not sure whether you should be building a WPF app for the desktop or a Silverlight app for the web, or even both, which a lot of companies do. Because these programming models are so similar, because the features are so similar, you should be able to move back and forth very, very easily. How do you get started? Well, probably the easiest way to get started is to start with Silverlight. If you think you might be moving back and forth, because Silverlight is the subset, it's easier to start with the subset. And as you move that to WPF, you should find mostly it just works. If you go the other way, you have to kind of keep remembering about what is and isn't in Silverlight. So that gets a little bit tricky. But I know a lot of companies have done that and have been very successful. So we're going to switch over and let's do some coding. So we're doing the canonical Twitter demo. I guess there's been quite a few of those today. But I'm going to do it mostly in code and avoid some of the tools. So it's going to be a little bit more sort of below the line than maybe some of the others. So I'm just going to start with, let's just start with a simple WPF application. And so I can just select this here, get this up and running. We'd like to start with empty projects, just to keep it real. But in the interest of time, I am going to cheat a little bit. I promise I could type all of this in by hand. But I've cheated a little bit, and I'm going to do some snippets for the things that I don't think are particularly interesting. And I'll run through this a little bit. So if I run this, it's probably easier to see. So this is the basics of the app. It's going to be a window. There's going to be a list box with some text in it. I put in some placeholder text saying hello PDC, and a big update button at the bottom. So this is our sort of basic UI. Pretty standard XAML stuff with a grid. I'm actually going to make it auto size, so let me just remove that. And let's change this to Twitter demo. Look, typing. And I guess since we've now called this Azure. Okay. There we go. That doesn't really show up on the monitor. But anyway, believe me, that's Azure. So that's the basic of the application, just as a placeholder. So true to as what I said, if I just cut that out, let's just actually do this with 2 copies. Start another copy of Visual Studio. File, new, project. And let's do a Silverlight project. I'm just going to keep the defaults for now. And give that a second. And I'm going to take a couple of liberties, again, more in the interest of time than anything else. Probably the first thing to note here is, on the Silverlight side, the default control is a user control, whereas on the WPF side, it's a window. So technically what I should do is, on the WPF side, is kind of go over to the Solution Explorer, do right-click, add new item, user control, put the code in there, and then make my window simply just host a user control. So that would make it a little bit more technically accurate. I'd then be using a user control both on the WPF side and the Silverlight side, but I'm just sort of cheating a little bit, and I'm just going to use window. And for the sake of this, and in fact, probably most applications, it doesn't matter. The thing that's interesting is kind of what goes in the grid, what goes in the main part of the UI. And that's going to be the same between the two. So let me flip over. So I can just take this, paste that, and if magic works, give it a second. Yes, so it's asking me if I want to debug this application, which I do in case it doesn't work. It's always good. We'll start up the local ASP service, and boom, there we go. So the point of this being, actually make this auto size as well. The point of this being, the basic UI for XAML is going to work the same between the two of those things. Let me run this again. And this is more sort of a tech demo than anything else, just to sort of highlight that point. There's a whole bunch of controls. There we go. Now it looks the same. There's a bunch of controls in the toolbox. Let's have a look. Silverlight XAML controls. So here's a bunch of controls. They're going to be very similar in most cases to the basic controls that we have on WPF. There's buttons and list boxes and a whole bunch of other stuff. So all of those controls will work the same. There are less layouts in Silverlight, but the most common one is grid, and there's a bunch of the other common ones. They're going to work exactly the same. So from a basic starting point perspective, your UI is going to work pretty much the same way. And if I'd done this in Blend, you would have seen it exactly the same. I could have done it in Cider in the designer part of it. Okay, well, that's the basic UI. Let's make this a little bit more interesting. So now I actually want it to do something rather than just sort of put up some basic window. So I'm going to add the event handler. So this is going to be my proxy for my business logic to make this sort of basic interesting. So I'm going to start with a web client since I want to make some web service calls. And let me have to right click, resolve, okay. It's a new web client. I see this is where the manager comes in. Inability to type. Credentials, love IntelliSense. So I'm going to add some credentials since I want to just authenticate this thing as myself. Network credential, PDC demo. So I'm going to make a client web request. I'm going to do this in a sort of more UI-friendly way, which is using async. So I don't want my UI to block. So what I'm going to do is first add a download string completed event. So I can add that. So I can find out when it's got downloaded. And I'm going to download the string asynchronously. I want to give it the URI to Twitter, which I can never remember. So again, cheating a little bit. Where's Twitter URI? There we go. My friend's timeline. Okay. So that's going to make this the web service call, and hopefully download the string. And since it's pretty compulsory, if you work at Microsoft and Anders is around, you have to use link for everything, which is actually in this case is extremely convenient. So I'm going to use a little bit of Xlink, which I am not I'm not much of a link guy. But this is about as simple as it's going to get. So I'm going to load new string reader, add some I/O just to get this in, and the result of the web service call is in result. So okay, so now I'm going to do, here's another sort of classic WPF application kind of thing, is using a data context. We're big on data binding, as hopefully many of you know. So we try and use sort of loose coupling between the UI and the logic as much as possible, and just use loose binding. So so this is a classic thing. Normally the data context would be something more interesting, like some complex data class. But since this is a super simple demo, I'm just going to set the data context to be the results of the link query. So from statuses, in XE. So I don't know if you know the format of Twitter, but it's about as simple as it gets. So it basically just has a bunch of sort of XML blobs, and the most interesting one being the status blob. So I'm going to select status. I'm going to pull out I think it's the text property. We'll find out in a second. So basically, I'm going to set the data context to the list of text pulled out of this, the result of this Twitter call. Then I'm going to do the classic data binding demo, rip out all the text that I just had in there static, and set the item source. And since the data context sort of sets the whole data context for the page, I can just use sort of an empty binding expression and wire that up. Okay, hit the update, and this is when you find out whether your network connection is working or not. Whoa! Okay. So here we have the 6-line sort of Twitter example running in WPF. So not terribly impressive, but hey, I'm a manager. So now I want to copy this business logic over to the Silverlight version just to see what happens. So I'm gonna be lazy and just take the whole UI. Do the whole same thing on here. So I'm just going to replace the grid. So now I've got the UI the same. Let's take the business logic. So I can take my button click, my download string, and where's my wrong side. See this? I knew this is what would happen when I'm running 2 copies of Visual Studio at once. Now I get confused about which one I'm in. So you have to yell out or throw something at me every time I start editing the wrong one. So here we're on Silverlight. So now I have to fix up some of these references. So the first thing is, oh dear, client credentials does not contain a definition of credentials. So I did this deliberately. The point here being, in the Silverlight version of Web Client, it's a cut-down version. So there's a bunch of things it can't do, sometimes for security reasons, sometimes just to keep the size down and limit the features a little bit. And credentials is one of those things that's not on the client object. So I'm going to just comment that out for a second and try not to worry about it. Here's another thing. I'll come back to that in a second for those of you who are reading ahead and could figure this out already. So here's another sort of little thing, but I wanted to bring this up. So in the default WPF project, link was included, whereas in the Silverlight application, it's not part of the default sample. So I'm just going to add it here. And now I can sort of resolve this reference. And I can resolve the I/O one as well. And hands up, who knows what's going to happen when I run this app? Busted. Yes, good example. Silence from the audience. So what's going to happen when I click update is I'm going to get a security exception, ignoring the fact that I didn't fill in the credentials. So this is the second sort of main point. The point of this being, when I'm running in Silverlight, I'm running as a web application. And as a web application, I'm restricted by typical web application security policy, unlike WPF that can do all sorts of crazy things. In Silverlight, I can't make cross-domain network calls. This app didn't come from the Twitter site. They don't have a client access policy that says anyone can call it. And so we're going to get a security exception when we try and call the Twitter API. So this is probably sort of the big sort of, oh, crap moment about moving things back and forth is there are some fundamental differences. It's not the code. It wasn't the XAML moving back and forth. It's the fact that I'm running, one of these things is running in a sandbox and has to obey by the web, sort of the web rules. And so you have to rethink some of these scenarios and sort of design them in a slightly different way to sort of get around some of these things. Now, maybe in the real world, I would try and call up the Twitter guys and say, hey, could you add a client access policy so I can call this thing? There's lots of services out there that are quite fine with you calling them cross-domain. There are proxy services that you can use to sort of get around this. But since we wanted to do this a little code-focused, I'm going to do this the hard way. And I'm going to create a little service and try and make this about as real world as I can get. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to add to my little ASP.NET side, I'm going to add a new service. And I should point out that when I thought about this demo and what I was going to write a couple of weeks ago, I had never written a web service in my life. So this was like, well, I wonder how this works. Well, I should probably right-click on that thing and see if there's oh, look, there's a thing called a web service. What if I just change that API? And basically, what you're going to see is what I did. And I was amazed it actually worked. Which shows that actually writing web services is way easier than I thought it was going to be. So I'm going to try and mimic, just to keep my code simple, I'm going to try and mimic the web client thing. So I'm going to call it download string. I'm going to take the URI, just like the real API. In fact, I'm going to just cut and paste. Well, actually, I'm just going to cut and paste this bit. Actually, no. Actually, I can do the whole thing. Sorry. Oh, actually, no, I'm not. I'm going to be a little clever while I do this. So hang on. Let me just resolve this, and I'll explain what I'm doing in a second. Oop. Let me try that again. Okay. Because I'm going to do this in a web service, this is what I was sort of umming and ahhing about. On the server side, I can make these calls synchronous because I can deal with the async nature on the client side. So I don't need to do two sets of async stuff. So I'm going to, for those who are into services, you'll get what I mean. But I can do the client credentials thing again. Since now this is going to be running on the services side, network credential. You get full access to the not the world's most secure password. But now I can just do the simple return client dot download, download string, and then just pass in the URI. So I don't need that. So it's a little bit simpler when you're doing the service, and I'll show how to wire this up in a second. Oops, typo. So build the service. So this was the stuff that I thought was just genius. Add service reference, big button labeled discover. Well, that was easy. I've now discovered the web service, and it does all the clever proxy stuff. And I'm basically done with that service. So, service for this to fix that networking issue in really a couple of minutes. So now what I can do, so I'm just leave that code there for reference. But now I've got I think I went just with the default name. Let me find out. Okay. So now I'm going to, instead of calling the original web service thing, I'm going to call my service one client thing. And the rest is, I can get rid of the credential thing because I'm doing that on the other side. But the rest is basically going to work pretty much the same way. Oh, no it isn't. Someone should be yelling out typos while I'm doing this, by the way. It will go a lot faster. Actually, so it's actually got a slightly different handler. So I'm just going to do that, just to have it fill in, just to save some time. And here I'm back to doing the async stuff. So now I've kept the async nature of what I wanted to do. And the rest of the code is, I think, build errors. Oh, ambiguous reference. So this is the downside of giving it the same API. I had to tell it which one because I've got both the .NET stuff and that service loaded. Hit update. Whoa, okay, so we're done. Whew, that was a relief. So so here's what we did. So we hit that basic sort of fundamental issue of I'm writing my little web service thing, and I have to deal with the security issues. So adding a little web service in the background allowed me to let it proxy and deal with the web service issue, so I don't have to deal with it. So the spirit of what I wrote, this is the point really, the spirit of what I wanted to write is basically the same thing, but I had to account for the differences in the different security models. So this is a sort of a long-winded way of saying that the business logic for most of your applications should just move over easily once you've accounted for the security differences. All right, so I want to change gears a little bit here and start talking. Let's talk about styling. So now I've got my basic app up and running. I want to make things a little bit more interesting. So let's switch back to the WPF application. And a fairly standard practice in WPF apps is just to put all your sort of common goo in the app XAML file, so it can be used by all your different pages and all your different things. So I'm going to just create a little style quickly. I'm going to style the button. So imaginatively, I will call it new button style. Target type is button. I'll do the world's simplest style, which is just use a setter to change the background property. And I'll change it to red. I should have changed it to Azure, but you can't see Azure, unfortunately. I didn't think of that when they designed the name. Oh, of course. Actually, this is a good point. Actually, let me just take this out a second before I forget. Here's something that is a subtle difference between WPF and Silverlight. Here I created a style for button, but I didn't give it a name. I didn't give it a key name. So basically, what that says in WPF is anything of type button should inherit that style, and it just applies to buttons globally. In Silverlight, and we'll get to this in a second, you have to use a key name. You don't get this automatic inheritance. It's not a huge deal, but you have to remember, as I forgot just then, you got to set the names on things. You don't get that sort of more complicated automatic inheritance. So the way you work around this, of course, here's my button. So I'm just going to set the style. Same standard WPF stuff. What did I call it? New button style. Hit F5. Boom, got my big red button. So that's about the simplest example we can do. So I'm going to copy this over to Silverlight. Here's my page again. Here's my button. Just replace that. So now I've referenced the style. Where's my app XAML? Here's my app XAML. Same. I have an app XAML on the Silverlight side. So I'm just going to cut and paste. Hopefully, I'm not going too fast. Hit F5 on Silverlight. Give it a second to think about it. And boom. OK, so this is kind of interesting. Kind of what I wanted, but kind of not. So I set the background to red. But here's one of these other subtle differences between WPF and Silverlight. On the WPF side, as a desktop application, its default style for the UI, in this case, since I'm running on Vista, looks like Vista. So the buttons look like Vista, the scroll bars look like Vista. If I ran that WPF application on XP, I'd get the default XP style. So basically, all I'd done is change the background of the button. So it basically took the WPF Vista style and just changed the background, which the template for buttons in WPF is make the whole background red. It actually does this slightly complicated, bizarre thing. If I show you here, if I set the focus to this thing, it then changes color, and it will now blink between red and the foreground color. So that's the default style in Vista and how it applies the background. For Silverlight, it has a sort of cross-platform theme that is going to look the same on a Mac, on Windows, and wherever you run it. And it's designed to be sort of fairly generic, but also a little bit more consumerish than the standard sort of Vista themes, which tend to look a little bit more enterprisey. And so now we're seeing sort of the subtle differences because the default styles are different between WPF and Silverlight. When you make these sort of point property changes, you can sometimes get different effects. So the trick, of course, is to be a little bit more dramatic in the style. It's like instead of just setting background property and overriding it, I want to use something a little bit more sort of meaningful. And again, in the interest of time, I'm just going to cut and paste some code rather than typing it in, if I can remember where it is. Well, actually, let's do this first. So I'm going to use some VSM. So VSM is the actually I'm going to do it on the Silverlight side first. So VSM is the new way of doing styling in Silverlight. It basically, if you were familiar with WPF, had this incredibly powerful but incredibly complicated property trigger event mechanism thing, which was very cool. But it was very difficult for tools to use. And there's been, I don't know whether we've done the talks on VSM yet, but if we haven't done the talks on VSM, there's going to be some interesting talks on VSM that explain this in more detail and how to use it from tools. I'm doing it the hard way, of course, so I'm just going to do it with some XAML. So I'm going to add a reference to the VSM assembly so I can start using the styles. There it is, U-button style. So this is where I did type all this in, because it would have been an exercise in typing errors for about 10 minutes. But I'll run through it quickly if you're not familiar with VSM. It does many of the same things that the sort of standard property system was designed for. So at the top, it's good old-fashioned normal setting properties. Actually, let me highlight this so you can see it. So I'm just setting my normal properties, and that's where I kept background to be red. And here I'm going to change the template of the button. So this is the usual thing of I want to completely change the look of the button. I want to keep the behavior, but I want to change it to something completely by my standards, what I think is cool. And so you do that by overriding the template property. And then what I have in here are a bunch of states. So the button in Silverlight advertises a bunch of states: common states, normal, mouse over, kind of what you'd expect, these properties, like pressed. And then what I'm doing is, essentially what I'm doing is when these states get triggered, I'm going to run a little animation, and this is the pertinent bits. I'm going to change the background to this gradient brush. And I'm going to do something similar when the button gets pressed, and I'm going to leave it the default for everything else. So in fact, again, to save typing, save a little bit of time, I'm just going to cut and paste the gradient brushes from here. So this is just a bunch of artwork that I don't want to have to type in. So I hit F5, and hopefully. So now we're still on the Silverlight side. Instead of just getting that sort of red fuzzy background thing, I've completely overridden the button. I've now put my little gradient in here, which is this kind of cool, shiny button. That goes slightly lighter when I mouse over, which is that state. And when I press it, it changes this to this sort of pressed-looking gradient thing. And that's all the VSM specifies. And if I hit update, it should still work. Overflow room sucks. Yes, thank you. So here's basically the sort of the model we're going to do. So we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to just cut and paste all of this stuff. Actually, let me just do this the cheating way. I'm going to switch over to WPF, do the same deal. And hands up, who knows what's going to work now. So I'm going to hit F5, and it's not going to work, of course. VSM is an undeclared namespace. And I could go through the long-winded demo. But basically what you're going to find is WPF 35SP1 does not include VSM by default. So I could fill in the namespace. It wouldn't do me any good. There is no VSM in 3.5. So what we've done, and it will be included, and we'll talk about this in WPF futures. So there will be VSM in future versions of WPF, but it's not there today. So what we've done is we put up on Codeplex the VSM project that you can download and use in your WPF applications as a sort of a little temporary workaround so you're not blocked. So I've already downloaded it from Codeplex. I'm going to add a existing project. I already downloaded it on this machine. Here it is, VSM. So now I have to add a reference to this. Add a little project reference. Oh, not to that. Give it a second. Add it this way around. Oh, add reference. Here we go. Project. So that's basically all it took to add VSM to my app. So, it's a little bit embarrassing we don't have it there, but not the end of the world. And here's the namespace. It's slightly different than the Silverlight one, which is why I didn't just cut and paste the whole thing, because it's in this extra assembly, this VSM assembly that I just added, this little sub-project thing that I added. And eventually that will go away, and it'll be the same on both sides. So now I've added VSM, and so now on the WPF side, now I've got the button looking exactly the same. And it's going to behave, hopefully, the same. There we go. Silverlight could really use triggers, don't you think? So I guess we should do questions through Twitter. That'd be kind of cool, actually. Yes, Silverlight could definitely use triggers. And in fact, I may as well answer the question. So definitely one of the things that we're thinking about. There's been sort of pros and cons about the VSM model is certainly much simpler and easier to tool around. But there are certain limitations for VSM. It covers a lot of these scenarios. But there's definitely places where triggers might help. And there's really no reason why we can't add them to future versions of Silverlight. It's a little bit complicated. We need a bit more of the property system moved over, so it'll take a little bit of time. But it's one of the reasons that we're here at events like this is to sort of get feedback on things like the styling system between the two and what we should move over when. That gives me sort of my basic sort of styling thing. But it's still not, a terribly, impressive application. So I want to do a couple more things to this and make it a little bit more real. So first of all, let's do something a little bit more interesting with the data side of things, because really, oh yikes, I really can't type today. So really, what class. So what I really want to do is make this a little bit more interesting. I'm going to add a property. Let's do text. I'm just going to do this the simple way. Username. So now I've got my little Twitter class that I'm going to use. I'm going to use basically the same link thing that I was using before, but rather than just sort of selecting a list of text out of the thing, I'm going to do, let's do this, new tweet. I'm going to set the text of that class to be the text that I had before, so that doesn't change. Now I'm going to set the username. It's basically the same thing. Statuses, element. If you've seen the sort of inner part of XML, of the Twitter XML, there's a user thing, and there's another, and then there's a name thing, and then get the value of that. Close that off. So that's now going to download the same data that I had before, but create this tweet class thing that gives me a little bit more power, and you can do the little debugging thing. Override, toString, return. Let's do, just to make sure it works, username plus, and then we'll add the text afterwards. And just see if this works. And now I should get, now we can see who actually said those comments. So now all I've done is just add a little toString thing and show that the basic logic is working. So now, okay, I've got a little bit more complicated class here. So now I want to do the real thing, which is what you would do typically in a real WPF application, which is use binding and templates to build the interesting parts of things in a sort of much more presentable way. So I'm going to do, here's my list box. I'm going to set my item template. Item template. Data template. I'm going to skip over a lot of the details here, but basically what I'm going to do, I'm just going to create a stack panel and put a couple of text blocks inside them, and then use binding to sort of pull out the right text. So binding, so let's put the username first, and font, let's do font weight bold, so we make it a little bit more obvious. Add another text block right underneath it. Oops. Perils of IntelliSense. I'm going to bind this to the other part of the data, which is probably the more interesting part, which is the text. Oops. And this, let's do font style italic. Okay. So now I hit update. So now we got a little bit more presentable thing. That now I'm seeing sort of names in, seeing the names in bold and the text in italic underneath. So classic sort of WPF application. So let's do the grand experiment again and copy this over to Silverlight. And where's my page? Just going to do the simple thing again of just replace the whole thing. And of course, I got to replace the business logic, which basically going to be the same thing from there on down. So I'm just going to change the data context, code behind. So from here, just replace all of that and build it. Let it start up, hit the update button. Woo, okay. So again, the main point being here, like now I'm getting into some more complicated bits of WPF. And it's working exactly the same thing on the Silverlight side of things. That styles and templates are working just the same. And I'm getting exactly the same results as I wanted on the other side. So let's take it one step further. And finish this off with the very last part of the classic sort of list box demo. And again, to save time, I am going to bring in an item container style. So here I'm going to use VSM again to style. Actually, I'm going to do this on the Silverlight side. This will make a better point. I'm going to use an item container style. Wrong example. Item container style to make the list box a little bit more pretty. So item container styles, if you don't know, is the thing that kind of goes around the items and the item template, so I can do some other custom styling. I need the VSM again, so let me just add the namespace, Silverlight VSM. Clean that up so it's a little bit readable. And if I hit update. So now this is now getting to the UI that I really wanted, and this is what I sort of envisioned when I started. I've now got a sort of nicely presented list box with item styling. As I mouse over these things, I get this sort of cool sort of red fade in effect, and now I'm happy on the Silverlight side. And so let's just switch over to the WPF side. I'd already put in the VSM, so I just need to add the namespace for VSM, WPF VSM namespace, hit F5, hit update, and I get the item container style. Oh dear. So what I don't get is that cool red thing where it was fading in. So that's a bit disappointing. So let me explain what's going on here. Of course, I did this deliberately. So what happens in VSM? What we did in VSM in the early version that's up on Codeplex, there'll be a new version coming out, is we did a kind of a clever thing. So there's all the basic code that we added to that project for VSM that does all the sort of clever triggering as states change. But in Silverlight, of course, I have a new button that when I hit the mouse down thing, it calls the VSM and says I'm now in the pressed state. So Silverlight has all those new controls. Well, I didn't move those over into WPF. In WPF, I still have the same old button and list box item and a whole bunch of other things that I've had, for the last few years. So what was going on with the reason it worked in the button case was we added a little, as part of the CodePlex sample, we added a little sort of hook class that hooked the standard WPF button and then overrode some of these events. So it basically hooked the properties from mouse down and called the VSM behind the scenes to change the states. And that way my styling all worked sort of nice and prettily. But of course, we only included a couple of sort of examples to get you going. We didn't include a list box item, which is what I was using. And so there was nothing to trigger the state changes, and so you didn't get that sort of cool transition effect. So basically what I want to do, I'm just going to quickly, I'm going to show how easy this is to do. And in future versions, we'll just include all this code. But since this is an expert talk, I wanted to just sort of do it live. So I'm going to create a new one of these things called list box item behavior. And this is just a copy of button. So I'm going to change button base to list box item. Just do some renaming, replace them all. And let's change button to list box item. Oh, replace all. Okay, so I've got the basics, the template thing here. I don't need a lot of this stuff. I'll explain a little bit of this as I go along, but running out of time a little bit. Basically, I'm going to hook the property that I wanted to wire up to the VSM, which is selected. That's the thing that actually does the as you move around through the list box that triggered the VSM. I had overridden the selected property. So I'm going to change the default state to unselected. And here's the hook proc. So when that property changes, I'm going to figure out if it is selected, if the list box item is selected, which is this thing. I'm going to go to state selected, else, and get rid of all this. Visual State Manager, go to state unselected. You get the strings right. Oh, good point. Thank you. Okay, now I don't need any other complicated stuff for button, just for this demo. Let's hit F5. Fingers crossed there are no more typos. Oh, brilliant. I forgot one thing. I knew I was going to do that. So basically now I've got this list box item handler. I need to wire it up. I need to initialize it. So there's a little bit of code here that registers it with the system. List box item behavior. So I just needed to add that item. He says famously, hoping this will work. Yes. Perfect. Yes. Okay. So anyway, so I'm gonna call it good there because we're getting close to the end. I wanted to leave a little bit of time for questions. Let me flip back to the machine. So press the right button for the machine. So basically, what I tried to show there was give you a sense for the kinds of things that work between WPF and Silverlight. That the basic UI works. That the styling, the templating, all the kinds of things that you expect work. There's a big difference because you're dealing with partial trust scenarios when you're running in a web app versus running in a desktop, so there's a big difference there. There's a few differences between Silverlight and WPF in terms of VSM, and there's a bunch of other things that I have in the slides. I can go through the slides for hours and hours and hours. They're really there for reference, so I encourage you to look at the slides to see the kinds of examples of other subtle differences between WPF and Silverlight. But at a very high level, it's the same programming model, it's the same design, and over time we're going to make them closer and closer together. We started at about, I made up a number that says we're 95% compatible, which is to say they're very compatible, but there are some subtle differences. With what we're planning on doing by including things like VSM and the new controls that are missing, WPF and Silverlight and .NET will end up being, I don't know, 97%, 98% compatible. And as time goes on, we're going to continue to add more things to Silverlight, maybe like triggers, and more things to WPF so that we can address the compatibility issues and bring them closer together without sacrificing sort of the big benefits of WPF on the desktop in terms of getting access to the full machine, nor sacrificing the big benefits of Silverlight in terms of access to the web and being this cross-platform, small plugin that's super fast and super lightweight. So anyway, hopefully that gives you an overview of WPF and Silverlight, what is the same and what is different. I think we've got time for questions, but I do ask that you use the microphones if you can. So if folks are interested in running off and grabbing food, feel free. If folks are interested in staying behind answering questions, I'll hang around for the sort of next 10 minutes until they kick us out of the room. The question was where are the slides and code? I think the slides will be on the drive, I'm hoping. They'll be posted on the PDC site anyway. Oh, question. Sorry. I thought you were going to yell. I'm just messing around with the PowerPoint.
What is the best practice for business logic assemblies that you share between a Silverlight and a WPF app in regards to what type of projects you use, how to make sure that the classes that you've got that work low level in a WPF app and all the properties and methods behave the same way in Silverlight, and how to get around the gotchas when they don't?
It's easier said than done, so you'll have to forgive me. But the easiest thing is to always start on the Silverlight side of things. Like create a sub-project for your logic and isolate it that way, so you separate your UI from your business logic. Do it on the Silverlight side of things so that you're always constrained by the subset. That is by far the biggest difference between WPF and Silverlight, is the fact that Silverlight is the smaller subset. And so you're much more likely to not hit issues. One of the things I didn't get to was there are bug differences as well. So that can be a little tricky. You have to test on both. We can obviously bugs we take very seriously, and anything that we get reported we'll fix. Things should behave the same between Silverlight and WPF.
Well, one example of a gotcha that I ran into the other day is the bitmap image object has different properties, or the properties themselves are set differently based on what type of application you're in.
Okay.
How do most people set themselves up to get around those types of things?
There's nothing magical. Typically, people just sort of set the defaults on both sides, so you don't inherit the default behavior. That one sounds a little odd, though. I'm going to bug Joe, that sounds more like a bug than anything else. So those are the kinds of things we should go fix.
Do most people go ahead and create separate Silverlight applications and WPF applications and just share the class files?
Yeah. Unfortunately, today you can't use the same projects between WPF and Silverlight, and we would like to fix that. But certainly you can share a lot of the code. You can cut and paste code back and forth. You can generate. Some people just use sort of the typical code forking thing and just sort of generate the code for both of them that is the same. For pure business logic or web service pieces, you can just use those. The project should work the same if you have a sub-project. They're agnostic of the differences between WPF and Silverlight generally, and you compile them twice. But it's certainly, this is sort of step one in this process. What we'd love to be able to do, and it'll take us a little while to get there, is that literally have the same binaries between the two, that you just have a subset and you can use them on both sides. And we're working towards that, and that's more of the future slide. But it's going to take us a while to get there, unfortunately.
Okay, well, I feel better about the mess we have there.
Okay, all right. Sorry. I'm sorry that you feel better. Yes, next, the other side.
We have a great web service we've been using for years, and we consume it with Compact Framework. We consume it with ADO or ASP.NET. It's worked great. We have a WPF app that works with it. Silverlight's no-go because we return ADO.NET data sets out of it, and right now there's no data table, no data set object in Silverlight. Do you have any comment on plans for supporting that down the road? Or?
I don't. Are there any of the ADO.NET folks here? I don't think there are. I'll have to get back to you on what the plans are. I will take it at least as a request. If you want to leave a card,
sure.
Scribble the question on a card. I'll probably make notes. Or send me emails, probably the easiest thing when I put my email up on here. And I'll find out the answer.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. Next question. Let's do the back right there, on the right, on stage right, left, whatever.
So I saw all your demos and everything were in Visual Studio 2008. What is the support for Visual Studio 2005 to build Silverlight and WPF applications?
I think you need 2008. I mean, you can just sort of edit the XAML yourself. There's nothing magical about it. And there's free tools, obviously, for 2008. There's the express versions of the tools and all the build tasks, so you can get the free things. But if you want the designer environment, the preview, and all that stuff, you need 2008. I'm sorry.
There was a plugin of some sort or an extension for 2005 for WPF. Is that still available, or do you guys pull it?
It might still be floating around, but it's not really supported. That was a temporary thing that we did just to, because 2005 was the only thing we had when we got started. Really, 2008 and beyond is really where we're spending our time. So if it works, it might still be around, and if it works, great, but it's not really something that we're supporting moving forward. We're really sort of moved on to 2008 and sort of embracing that future.
Don't touch it.
Use the Express versions, I'm being told, right? Okay, use Express. Everything, I think this was the full version, but I could have done this easily in Express. I didn't show anything here that needed anything more than the Express keys. Let's switch over to this side at the front.
So is Silverlight coming to mobile platforms?
Silverlight is coming to a mobile platform.
What kind of platforms?
So what have we announced? I think we've announced Windows Mobile. I think we've announced Nokia. I'm sure there'll be more. I don't know. I don't know. That's Nokia is Symbian, right? S60,
yes.
The S60 platform. I think we've announced that. I hope we've announced that.
iPhone?
In which case, we just announced that. No, I know we've announced that. We would love to do an iPod. That has more to do with Apple than it has to do with us. And Flash is in the same boat, and everyone's in the same boat. If you're trying to do bytecodes on an iPhone or an iPod Touch, then they don't allow that yet. But maybe someday. Who knows? So would love to. The goal for Silverlight, of course, is to be on every desktop, every web, and every device. It'll take us a little bit of time to get there, but clearly focusing on mobile phone scenarios is a key thing. And I think there's a Silverlight mobile talk. I wish I had there's a Silverlight mobile talk, so I encourage you to go to that talk and go ask them that question, and they'll tell you what's going on there. Great question, thank you. Let's go to this side of the front.
Yeah, thank you. An issue that I ran in was using dynamic resource markup extension instead of static
resource.
Yeah, when using themes, maybe you can tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, we don't have support for dynamic resources. To be serious, that kind of goes in the same vein as triggers. There's a number of features that are important for styling, sort of dynamic styling in general, that we don't have in Silverlight. It really is a side effect of the fact that the property system in Silverlight is a much simpler, arguably faster, actually it is faster, but much simpler system. And so it doesn't have the same support that we have in the full-blown WPF for those kinds of dynamic changes. It comes up a lot. I can't say exactly when we're going to get around to that kind of thing, but I'll add it to the list of things that we want to get supported. It's high on the list of things that we want to support, dynamic styles, and dynamic styling in general, rather than sort of the style it once at load time and then everything has to be set. You have to write a lot of code today if you want to have the same kind of dynamic styling in Silverlight as we already have in WPF, and we'd like to sort of move away from that over time, but it's a tricky problem.
Thank you.
Let's go to the back on this side.
Our organization has built a composite application using the cab.
Sure.
And we're looking at probably converting to WPF at some point. Is it possible to do Silverlight composite applications?
Wow.
Or recommended?
Where's Glenn? I don't know how to answer that question. Prism 2, I'm being told. I hope that's someone on the Prism team who's saying Prism 2. No, okay, but someone with authority has just said, or no authority whatsoever, has just said Prism 2. I think you can take it for granted that we're very interested in taking the cab model more broadly. So obviously we took that from WinForms into WPF, and we want to take that to Silverlight. But I'll have to get back to you. Hopefully the Prism guys are around and can answer that question. Oh, perfect. So I'm already ahead of myself. There is apparently an early drop of Prism 2 already. So I'd encourage you to go up to the Prism site and download that, check it out, and send us feedback. It seems like it's already in the works. Let's go this side at the front.
A couple of quick questions about coming features for Silverlight 3. What is going to be your process for letting us know what might be in or what might be out? And by the way, got 3 quick requests.
Okay, sure.
Would be in.
Joe's making notes here.
I mean, part of this
Joe, the GPM for Silverlight.
Part of this is just due to the fact that we can't do anything that you don't let us do.
Of course.
In Silverlight, and so we're really dependent on where we've got missing features right now.
You mean native extensions? There's no
on getting to things, but capture, sound capture, video capture capabilities, the ability to
webcam.
Pardon?
Webcam as well as sound capture. Sorry, that's usually the first question we get is where's the webcam support? So
well, and printing support.
Printing. Oh, logical printing.
Yeah.
I will say I'm not sure we can talk too much about when they're coming up, but I will say that those are probably some of the most requested features for Silverlight, which basically means we're going to add those as probably as quickly as we possibly can.
GPU support as well.
Yeah. What GPU support do you want? Says Joe. Joe, you should just come up here and answer.
Well, when we ask why there's performance differences, we're told that between WPF and Silverlight, and to the detriment of Silverlight, we're told it's because of the lack of GPU support. So
yeah, we're always looking at how to get Silverlight to perform better. It is obviously hard to do cross-platform GPU support. It's not impossible. So we're going to continue to work on how we can push the boundary on hardware support for Silverlight. I don't think we have anything we can talk about. It's too early. We should probably get specific scenarios because GPU support is like this much. Let's say like doing 3D GPU support will take a while if you want like DX level support. There's smaller steps along the way that we could definitely do. So we should get very specific about what scenarios you want to be hardware accelerated sooner rather than later. Because it's a ton of work just doing it in a cross-platform way. So we just have to prioritize very carefully. So it's going to be a bit of a sort of a vote. I mean, it kind of leads to the question about how we decide. We have events like this, and we say, who wants GPU acceleration? Raise your hand. And versus all the other features that we have. Yes, literally, somebody raised their hand. And we go through all the different scenarios that we could possibly imagine for the next sort of say 12 to 18 months. And then we prioritize features based on feedback. And we'll get to everything eventually. It's just going to take a while. But hardware acceleration is definitely higher on the list. Thank you. Let's go this side at the front.
That's actually another vote for printing.
Oh, printing, yes. Logical printing versus bitmap printing. Yeah. That's.
So the question is, for this show, will there be any other of the sessions that are likely to go into any detail of that on the roadmap?
For Silverlight?
Yeah. Because the better looking XAML, I see better XAML in the Silverlight context than in WPF, but you can't print from them.
Yeah. We're going to talk a little bit about some Silverlight things, but I think it's a bit early, given that like Silverlight 2 just shipped like 2 weeks ago. So I think we're still really in the early planning phases for Silverlight 3 and beyond. I think you expect to learn more at Mix early next year. I think things that are blindingly obvious. I think we already talked about H.264 support that didn't make Silverlight 2 that's going to show up in the next version. So there's a few things that we've teed up.
It's safe to at least tell them that we're working on printing.
We're working on printing. We can say that.
Yeah,
okay.
We are clear. We have bodies who are actually working on that feature.
Okay.
So the other thing someone asked about GPU, we are thinking about that. We have bodies who are actually
working on
at that.
So we have bodies working on GPU. We have bodies working on printing.
It's not some pie in the sky roadmap. We actually have people focused on it. So
Yeah.
Okay.
We'll ship it when it's ready.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Let's go to the back on this side. That's you. Yeah. Sorry.
What about Microsoft's products like Office, SharePoint, and WinForms based on InfoPath? How will they evolve?
Sorry, say that again. How will they
evolve?
Using Silverlight or WPF?
Yeah.
That's hard to say. We are working with all of those groups on Silverlight and WPF for their products, but not being those product managers, I'm nervous about talking about anything in specifics. So I'll probably have to sort of run around and find a SharePoint person or an Office person to sort of talk about it. I know you can grab me at the end. If you can give me more specifics about what you're looking for, I'll try and get you a more specific answer. But basically, the general story is there are tons of groups around Microsoft working on both WPF and Silverlight projects, literally hundreds of groups, some of which have already shipped. Blend obviously shipped with WPF, and then Origami, and there's a whole bunch. And you've seen, I think, a lot of the Microsoft properties moving over to using Silverlight over time. And now that 2 is out and an officially supported product, not a beta, you'll see a lot more coming out of Microsoft in those sort of more meaty, applications and platforms like SharePoint and like Office. It will take some time. It obviously takes a while for any team inside any large company, especially Microsoft, to adopt a new technology, but they're definitely coming. So you'll see a lot more in the next year or so.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Let's go to the back on that side.
Sure. So I don't know if anybody asked the question. I was in the overflow room.
Oh, sorry.
But so multi-touch support in Silverlight?
We've been thinking about it. It's a tough one to do. Let me add that as a vote for what you'd like to see. It's probably going to take a little bit longer to get multi-touch support just for the platform differences. You'll see that in WPF on the desktop very soon.
Okay, thanks.
And at the front?
Hi, are there any plans to do a standalone Silverlight like the Adobe Air?
Not really. You can kind of do it. You can use a HTA or one of those other containers. Silverlight needs a host. It needs we're using the browser for networking services and to put up a window. So you need some kind of host. There's nothing it's an ActiveX control or an NP plugin. So there's nothing to stop you from writing an NP plugin host thing on the Mac or an HTA-like thing or just hosting the ActiveX control on Windows. It's not really a priority for us. We have a desktop solution in WPF and full-blown .NET. We're pretty happy with the 92% market share that has. The cross-platform scenarios that we have seen where you need the broadest reach are really, we've seen them mostly web scenarios. So I'm not going to say never, and that would be silly. But right now, mostly the feedback that we're getting has been to really focus on the web app side of things for RIAs and really drive that with Silverlight, those scenarios. The desktop is hardware acceleration, integration with Office, syncing with hardware and devices, and we already have a really good solution there with full-blown .NET. So there's definitely ways to address a lot of those scenarios. If you just don't like the browser Chrome, like you want to get rid of the back next button, a lot of these guys, like in the video space, just go full screen, and you get rid of the Chrome, and you can put your own UI, and that covers a lot of the basic scenarios. So I never say never, but it's not on the cards.
Can I ask what you want to do?
What do you want to do?
You have a lot of functionality in Air, like the Twitter reader. So you just want to create small utilities to run on the desktop. Yeah.
And you want something lighter weight than .NET?
Lighter weight than .NET.
Okay, yeah, we're still, on the desktop, we really want, generally what we're seeing is people wanting to take advantage of the desktop. You want to run in the background, you want to do a tray notify icon, you want to really integrate with Windows when you're on Windows. When you're on the Macintosh, you really want to integrate with the Macintosh. And when you're on Linux, you really want to integrate with Linux for the appy level things. So I think we're always a bit worried about sort of creating these lowest common denominator things that outside of the browser scenario. So this is our bias, obviously.
But it would be great to do .NET cross-platform.
Well, out of the I will certainly take the feedback. Yes. Thank you. More questions? I think we have. Oh, okay, at the back. Thank you.
What's the latest adoption rate
for Silverlight? I don't know. We're in the hundreds of millions. It's actually I don't know what the 25%.
Depends on where you are.
Yeah, it's a really hard question to answer because what we can measure very easily is number of downloads, but then you get this sort of astronomical number, which if you're in Asia where you're in an internet cafe that they get rebooted every day, and there's a download on millions of machines every day on the same machine. So downloads doesn't really tell you much. We look at how many people, when they visit our properties, or how many people already have Silverlight installed because of the user agent string. But that, people block the user agent string. It's not terribly accurate. So we're in the hundreds of millions sort of worldwide, hand wave. And in certain markets, it's a very high percentage. Kevin?
The public numbers are 1 in 4.
Okay, the public numbers are worldwide are 1 in 4, so 25%.
Some markets it's up to about 50%.
So that would be Asia.
It's much lower, obviously, to round out.
Yeah.
But in general, we're comfortable saying 1 in 4.
So we're comfortable saying 1 in 4. And obviously the goal is, we're not done until that's 98, 99%. It's not going to happen overnight. But a lot of things that we've been doing, like the Olympics, have been driving adoption, and we'll keep doing those kinds of things. I think you'll see those numbers just rising over time. It's just a matter of time. It takes a while to get a billion machines updated. But it is one time. That's the thing, is once we get this going, because of the update mechanism, once we've got everybody covered, all the updates after that will happen automatically. So it's a one-time thing. And of course, we've tried to make the install, if you don't have it, about as easy as we could make it. This 10, 15 second install thing. So it's not that big a deal, he says.
How about 64-bit support?
64-bit support, Joe.
It's something that's on our roadmap. And I mean, that's written down on our roadmap. It's something that we hear a lot. I guess we hear a lot from developers.
You might need the mic, Joe, I think.
So it's one question I ask you is, what are your scenarios for?
I run IE8 on 64-bit.
You run IE8 on 60. Are you a developer by chance?
I am, but I would just like to be able to use Silverlight apps on my...
Yeah, we've heard the feedback, and it's something we'd like to do there. One of the issues on our side is just the penetration of browsers that would actually support that in a native fashion. So not a lot of people are running 64-bit. Not a lot of browsers support 64-bit plugins. So from that standpoint...
I don't know anything about IE8, or 64-bit architecture, but could you do a 32-bit version of Silverlight that would run inside a 64-bit browser?
So it doesn't. That's not it. So basically,
Kevin,
64-bit version
Kevin,
of IE.
you have to mic. Sorry.
The 64-bit. Whoa, sorry, I was yelling.
Sorry, sound guy.
The 64-bit version of IE had decided not to support 32-bit plugins. So there's no choice when you do that, because that was an IE decision. But there's a 32-bit version of IE that really runs most of the web. There's many plugins that don't work.
On 64-bit machines.
That runs on 64-bit machines, and that's the one that you should use. When I use it, there's a choice of IE or IE x86. That one will work. So in general, the real technical problem we've got is we don't have optimized codecs for 64-bit. So for video codecs, right now, the ones we have for 64-bit are just not tuned, and there's not a priority about tuning those. There's other platforms we tune them for. So as we get those tuned codecs, that's really the only thing blocking us. Most of our code actually works, but the video it's not worth it. The video is just simply slower, right? Because nobody's went and gone and tuned, doing all the hand assembly to make those codecs as fast as they can be. So we'll work on that. And really the only scenario we've found that kind of is where people want to use it more is when they embed the IE 64-bit version of the control in their 64-bit app, like you're talking to be able to host the WebOC, to be able to use this, like, basically people host a WebOC outside of the browser. That ends up being a problem because they can't make their native 64-bit app work if they're going to host a web browser that happen to have Silverlight content inside of it. That's the one blocking where there's really not a good workaround. But as far as typically browsing the web, you just use the 32-bit version, and we do test on that one.
So next question, sorry, with apologies to the sound guy. Up front, right here.
So does Silverlight support sockets, and if so, with what limitations?
So I can...
Okay, you want to just yell into the mic.
Hey, Ian, how's it going?
Okay, let's not do that.
Sorry. Don't mean to make you uncomfortable. It does support, Silverlight 2 supports sockets. We do have some restrictions in terms of the ports that you're allowed to use on sockets. So, for example, you can't, probably the main thing is you can't do a listener, is one of the things. So you couldn't do a socket listener, you could just do a connect. We restrict the ports that you can connect to. And the reason being is there are certain things that you'd be able to do that would allow you to spoof HTTP, for example, that could open up security issues. So the main things are port restrictions and not being able to do a listener.
Okay.
Okay, I think we're going to have to go. So we'll be outside. We'll be in the track lounges. Please come by, ask more questions, and thank you for your time.